The Modernization of Japan, 1800-1914. The feudal Bakuhan system, established in the early 1600s by the Tokugawa shogunate, continued to operate in Japan until the mid-19th century. Under this system, the shoguns, based in Edo, modern Tokyo, ruled with the support of local daimyo, who were sovereign in their own territories. The emperor, based in Kyoto, remained a semi-divine ceremonial figurehead. Foreign contact. Foreign contact. The Tokugawa shoguns, how do you pronounce that? Tokugawa. Well, that's all right. That's one I nailed it. I nailed shogun. Shogun. The Tokugawa shoguns tried to limit contact with foreigners concerned about threats to their culture and sovereignty. However, from the late 1700s, foreign powers began to apply increasing pressure on Japan to open itself to trade. The shoguns continued to rebuff these advances until 1853, when a U.S. gunboat expedition led by Commodore Matthew Perry arrived. The presence of U.S. warships in Japanese waters was sufficient to persuade the shogunate to grant the first concessions to a Western power, permitting trade through two ports. Under American pressure, more Japanese ports were soon opened to international trade. In the 1860s, a growing xenophobia. In the 1860s, a growing xenophobia infected many young samurai, and attacks were carried out against foreign traders and their vessels. The anti-foreign movement was particularly strong in Western Japan, where it evolved into an organized rebellion against the shogunate, who were blamed for allowing the foreigners in. In 1867, leaders of two Western domains, Choshu and Satsuma, organized a coup by bringing to power the young Emperor Meiji. Choshu Satsuma forces defeated the shogunate army in a brief civil war. By 1869, the revolution known as the Meiji Restoration was complete. Meiji reforms. Although the Meiji Restoration implied a return to imperial rule, in fact, the emperor's main role in the new government was to confer legitimacy and act as a unifying symbol in a divided nation. The government based at Edo, now renamed Tokyo, was dominated by a young samurai from Choshu and Satsuma. All of them believed in the need to strengthen Japan to resist foreign incursion, but they were divided over how to achieve this. Conservatives wished to preserve the traditional social order, while radicals believed modernization was the answer. Radicals prevailed. Before Japan could modernize, however, it had to unite under a single centralized authority. In 1871, the feudal Bakuhan system was abolished, and daimyo domains were replaced by prefectures administered by government appointed officials. The traditional Japanese social hierarchy was abandoned, and citizens were given equal status regardless of background. These angered many samurai, but their rebellions were all swiftly crushed by the new conscripted army. Japan became more pragmatic about the question of foreign influence, accepting the need to learn from the West as a means of strengthening itself. During the 1870s, Meiji leaders traveled to Western countries to study their laws and institutions. These inspired widespread reforms in Japanese education, the armed forces, and the tax system, and was followed in the 1880s by political reforms, including the introduction of a limited form of representative government. Japan imported Western plants and materials, including steam engines, cotton spinning mills, and steel, to fast track its own industrialization. By the 1890s, Japanese factory production was already having a major impact on the economy, reducing reliance on foreign imports. Expansion. By the mid 1890s, Japan was sufficiently self assured to persuade the Western powers to renegotiate the treaties signed by the Tokugawa shogunate and provide more favorable terms for Japan. The Meiji leaders were now determined to develop a colonial empire, partly as a defensive buffer and partly for international prestige. The first expansionist moves had been made in the 1870s when Japan took advantage of King China's weakness to acquire the Ryukyu Islands and increase their influence over Korea. China remained the key obstacle to Japanese expansion in the region, and in 1894, Japan launched a surprise attack on Chinese forces in Korea. Japan's newly modernized armed forces defeated the Chinese in 9 months. Under the subsequent Treaty of Shimonoseki, 1895, China recognized Korean independence and ceded Taiwan, the Pescadores, and the Liaodong Peninsula in southern Manchuria to Japan. Concerned over Japan's growing dominance in East Asia, the Western powers then forced a revision to the treaty, making Japan forfeit Liaodong. Making Japan, let's look up this word because I don't know, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Forfeit. Forfeit Liaodong, making Japan forfeit Liaodong. Russo-Japanese War. When Russia began to increase its own influence in Korea and southern Manchuria in the late 1890s, it stirred resentment in Japan. In February 1904, the Japanese Navy attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in the Liaodong Peninsula. The ensuing war lasted until May 1905 when the Japanese wiped out the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, forcing them to surrender. Japan's victory shocked the world and marked its arrival as a global power. Under the Treaty of Portsmouth, Russia handed control of the Liaodong Peninsula and the southern half of Karafuto to Japan and acknowledged Japanese influence in Korea. That influence gradually increased, and in 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea. Japan now had a defensive buffer zone stretching from Karafuto in the north through Korea in the west to Taiwan in the south, and a major sphere of power in East Asia. Timeline: 1853, a U.S. naval force under Commodore Perry forces Japan to open its ports to U.S. trade. 1863, 1864, Western forces attacked Kagoshima and Shimonoseki after attacks on Westerners by Satsuma and Choshu rebels. 1867, Choshu Satsuma samurai rebel against shogunate. 1868, the Meiji Restoration. 1877, samurai rise up in protest against Meiji reforms, the Satsuma Rebellion. 1889, the Meiji Constitution is introduced. 1894, 1895, Sino-Japanese War. 1902, the Anglo-Japanese alliance recognizes East Asia as being within Japan's sphere of influence. 1904, 1905, Russo-Japanese War. 1910, Japan annexes Korea. Excellent. Now let's move on to crime. Let's read this book about crime. Can you read it there? Well, can you read this well? Okay, I think that's okay. Now let me look up the name of this guy and how to pronounce it correctly, because I have an idea, but I'm not sure.
Andrei Chikatilo.
Okay, yeah, that was originally what I thought. Andrei Chikatilo. Between 1978 and 1990, a serial sex murderer who became known as the Forest Strip Killer terrorized the region around Rostov in southern Russia. When he was finally caught, he turned out to be a mild-mannered school teacher and Communist Party member called Andrei Chikatilo, who'd committed at least 53 murders of women, children, and drifters over a period of 12 years. Chikatilo, though, who'd confessed to them all, was found guilty of only 52 of them. For another man had been executed for the first of his murders, that of a 9-year-old he'd lured into a rented shack at the age of 42. That first killing of Chikatilos, however, set the pattern for all the rest. For Chikatilo was impotent, and after choking the 9-year-old and attempting unsuccessfully to rape her, he ended up violating her with his fingers. It was the sight of the blood from her ruptured, how do you pronounce that? Hymen. It was the blood from her ruptured hymen that seems to have set him off, for he stabbed her repeatedly in what became a frenzy of sexual excitement, and from then on, power, blood, sex, torture, and death became inseparably interlinked in his mind. It was 2 years before he struck again, his victim this time, a 17-year-old girl playing hockey from school who was willing to have sex for the price of a meal. He took her into the woods and beat her to death. Then he bit off one of her nipples and masturbated over her corpse. From then on, the number of tortured and mutilated bodies began to pile up. Older women, children, and teenagers of both sexes. In 1984, Chikatilo was actually arrested by an investigating detective who noticed him behaving strangely on a bus. The door rope, a long coil of wire, and a knife were found in his briefcase. He was eventually released because his blood type didn't match that of the killers. As it turned out, the bespectacled Chikatilo, fortunately for him, was a medical anomaly, for his semen and blood type were different. A, B, and A. He was struck off the list of suspects. He was finally caught many brutal murders later, only in October 1990, when the last of his victims was found in woods near a remote country station. A policeman remembered asking a man he'd seen emerging nearby, dressed in a gray suit with cuts to his finger and ear for his identity. It was Chikatilo. He was first put under surveillance and then pulled in. After several days grilling, he confessed. Put on trial in April 1992, he had no excuses, though he did mention that he'd seen his elder brother eaten by his neighbors in Ukraine during the famine of the 1930s. He said, "When I used my knife, it brought psychological relief. I know I have to be destroyed. I understand. I was a mistake of nature." He was executed by a single gunshot behind the right ear on Valentine's Day in 1994. Here you have a photo of this despicable man. Chikatilo always professed his guilt once he was captured. Thank you so much for being there, guys, and see you tomorrow for another reading session. Take care. Goodbye.